Hello, everyone, and welcome to incorporating ChatGPT into critical thinking assignments. My name is Marta Kordkowska, and I will be presenting this session. I'm the Director of Educational Technology and Strategy, and I'm housed within the Levy Library. This presentation was created in conjunction with Scarly and Research Technologies, and we're excited to share with you some foundational insights. Please note we are recording this session. And our asynchronous content will be distributed via email. Also look out for an evaluation link. Please include your questions in the chat and I will get to them at the end of our session today. Just to orient us again, this is part of a 7-course series, and we are currently in incorporating ChatGPT into critical thinking assignments, a session geared towards educators, along with the other blue planets. We had a total of 7 courses, all again will be released asynchronously, centered around foundations of ChatGPT, though each of our courses are about 45 minutes in length and aimed at foundational knowledge. So some learning objectives for today's session. We hope to describe language to include in course materials for guidelines on use and non-use of AI, evaluate assignments to identify opportunities to promote higher order thinking with an emphasis on Bloom's taxonomy, and discuss where AI could be beneficial to learning and how to implement guidelines for use. Before we dive into the content, we really wanted to address some concerns that educators have, right? And it's not just educators within our institution, but educators globally teaching many different types of students. And so it's this catch-22 almost a scenario, right? Where the concerns are students will use AI to complete assignments. In turn, this will result in submissions not reflecting student work, making it difficult to both assess and help a student where they are, right? To really understand someone's true capabilities. And also, that'll then lead to an erosion of critical thinking skills, and that loop continues. And so, we wanted to address that to start our session because these are very real concerns, and they're not just in students, right? But throughout society in general, and with the invention of the new tool or bringing new tools to the forefront. So we'd like to start out about how we're going to sort of talk about this topic, or at least start the discussion in this 45 minutes. But as we dive into the course, we want to think about AI tools, right? Discovering different AI tools and their evolution, considering possible applications of each tool, and attending workshops and other learning opportunities to stay in the know. And so that's not only for us to get on the framework for this course, but in general, before your course, as you think about your courses and as you think about creating your courses and designing them or redesigning them. These are some things you might want to consider for a multitude of reasons. The next is course design, and we'll talk a little bit about considering a flipped classroom, a focus on promoting critical thinking skills, second and third order applications in class, and having those discussions with students in the moment, and integrating AI use into assignments. So when appropriate, and I can't stress that beginning, when appropriate, demonstrate acceptable use, set guidelines, and discuss where it is not conducive to the outcome or to learning. And again, we recognize the challenges there. So we'd like to start off with an overview of a possible conversation that you might have with a student. And I understand that this is small on the right-hand side. Don't worry, we're going to pull those things out for you in the subsequent slides. But really thinking about, okay, when we're having a conversation, when we're setting the stage in a new class, we're thinking about the purpose or goal of the assignment. We're talking about content and use restrictions. We're talking about what is appropriate use and other ethical considerations. So framing that conversation with the class at the start or with an individual student or a mentee might be one way to start these conversations. So this is a document that you may have seen in previous sessions. We share this document often. It was created within Mount Sinai, and it was really to help structure a conversation with somebody who is writing a thesis proposal in this case, but it can be applied in a variety of different ways. So that first section discusses what is the purpose. So the purpose of this form, or if you're adapting it, the purpose of a conversation or the purpose of a section of a syllabus. And what are we getting at with the use of generative AI? The second is understanding the implications for intellectual property and privacy loss with the use of AI. So really talking about, okay, you will not be able to preserve your intellectual property if you are uploading things to AI possibly, right? Or you are also unable to take credit for something that AI has done, right? You might not be able to copyright that information. And that goes straight into publishing restrictions. And again, I know assignments aren't publishing, but just the thought of restrictions in submitting assignments, right? You might amend that to fit that space, to fit the copyright work. And so that leads us directly into thinking about clear syllabus wording. So this this slide or this example was taken from actually Harvard's application of an example for their faculty. And so what it focuses on is what we see on the left-hand side. It's really focusing on, is the use of AI, in this case, fully permitted? So can you fully use it in your classroom? Is it partially permitted? So can you use it in some cases? Is it permitted with citations? So it's okay to use it as long as you share that you've used it. Is it permissible for certain assignments? So in this case, you can use it, but in a different case, you cannot. And how will students know if it's permitted or if it's partial use? In what ways is it permitted or is it fully prohibited? And this could be course specific, right? It's not a department policy. It's something, it could be assignment specific, so on and so forth. So Harvard put forward this guidance for their instructors. Certain assignments in this course will permit or even encourage the use of generative artificial intelligence tools such as ChatGPT. And we say generative artificial intelligence because we are using artificial intelligence when we use, spell check, or when we use like predictive typing or Grammarly, right? But that's not generative. So we're using the word generative to sort of define the AI that we're talking about. And so the default for this example is that such use is disallowed unless otherwise stated. So they start off with saying it is prohibited. However, if a certain assignment or moment or instructor says that you can use it, you can use it. But any such use must be appropriately acknowledged and cited. And so that could mean simply stating that AI was used to complete this work, or it could mean stating AI was used to complete this portion of this work, and that's what it was just that portion of the work that was completed, and these are the prompts that was used, right? It would depend on what that instructor would be looking for. And then it is each student's responsibility to assess the validity and applicability of any generative AI output that is submitted. You bear the final responsibility. Violations of this policy will be considered academic misconduct. And I think in every single session that we've led and any AI content that I've watched, I think the biggest thing is when you're using AI for anything, you must validate that information, right? And it's an iterative process, and it's on the human in the loop to both start that process, but also to make sure that the information that is being produced is accurate and verifiable. And then finally, I think my favorite sentence of the entire policy, if I can say so myself, is we draw your attention to the fact that different classes at this university could implement different AI policies. It is each student's responsibility to conform to the expectations for each course. And I think that that's really important because different courses have different sort of outcomes, right? And different areas that they're going into, but two, you also set the stage for your colleagues. And I think that that was something I heard a lot, when I was teaching. Well, in so-and-so's course, right? And so setting the stage for, yeah, okay, maybe it's okay in my course, but not in somebody else's. So now that we've really focused on I would say the foundational conversational pieces, and again, in a very foundational way, I want to move us towards talking about assignments in Bloom's taxonomy. So we all may be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, right? Starting at the bottom to remember and sort of evolving into this ability to apply, analyze, and then eventually create something. And so AI is almost flipping or influencing that Bloom's taxonomy is going upside down. So now what we're thinking is it's really, can we analyze like that created piece? Can we evaluate that created piece? Can we apply what's been created to what we know, what we comprehend, what we remember? And you need all of these areas of this pyramid in order to be able to assess and verify, right, what AI has done. So thinking about Bloom's taxonomy and AI, Oregon State University came up with this chart. And this chart has really been a great resource for me as I've been teaching. Don't worry, I know it's small. We'll pull certain aspects of this out. But what's really important here is looking at what the distinctive human skill is in each of the areas of Bloom's taxonomy and how Gen AI can potentially supplement learning, but not replace that human skill. And so this might help in thinking of how to design critical thinking assignments or design assignments with this in mind. So to start, for create, it's a distinct human skill to be both creative and have a cognitive process that's leveraging human lived experiences, social emotional interactions, intuition, reflection, and judgment to formulate original solutions, right? Remember, the way that AI works is in a predictive model. And if there's any linguists in the room, the idea is you're simply predicting the next word in a sequence that's most likely in the densely semantic neighborhood. And so that's not an original solution. That's a predictive model, right? Very robotic in nature, for lack of a better word. So it's uniquely a human skill to be able to take our lived experiences and attach them to formulate these original solutions to whatever is happening. But with that being said, ChatGPT could support the brainstorming process, possibly suggest alternatives. You could have a conversation with generative AI, going back and forth about things that you're thinking about. It can help you list potential drawbacks and advantages, describe successful real world cases, create tangible deliverables based on human inputs. But those inputs are those original solutions. There's that original intuition and reflection and judgment that you can't replace with a generative AI. Moving on to evaluate, I'm going to flip to the right side first, thinking about how generative AI can support learning in this space. Again, it's a lot of identification, right? So if you look at those the verbs, we're talking about identifying or checking, right? It's very look at the pros and cons of various examples, develop and check against evaluation rubric, something that you have to have in front of you. While the human can engage in something that's more metacognitive. How did this process take place? Where is something that went well? What is something that could be acted upon? Why could it have, knowing all of the surrounding consequences or nuanced variables, how could this have gone differently, right? In appraising something like this. It can appraise ethical consequences. It can identify significance or situate within a full historical or disciplinary context. So it can pull many different lived experiences. And so thinking about how to move from just this identification of pro versus con to how do I pull various aspects of my knowledge in to make a decision for possible different courses of action. When we look at analyzing, sort of moving down that pyramid, where we, the human, can critically think and reason, right? Again, that critical thinking, that reasoning, and justify the analysis with depth and with clarity. If you've ever used generative AI, you could probably notice that you get a lot of surface level answers unless your prompt and the information that you're providing ChatGPT or another generative AI tool is filled with the content that needs to be included in whatever that output is. So going into these deeper levels, right? Again, compare and contrast, just like pluses and minuses, we're seeing a trend here. inferring trends and themes in a narrowly defined context, compute, predict, interpret, and relate to real world problems, but not in a metacognitive type of approach, right? Not a lot of depth and possibly not enough clarity. When we look at apply, we're thinking about the human being able to operate, implement, conduct, execute a lot, actually be able to do the thing, right? I think that that's the big area. Like, yes, ChatGPT or other AI models can provide us a process, a model, a method, an instruction sheet on how to solve something. But when it really comes to the application process, only the human can really implement, conduct, execute those areas, right? And test them in the real world. Apply this essentially human creativity and imagination, troubleshoot on the spot, right? Could you imagine being in with a patient and something's going wrong and you're like, oh, these were my guidelines and now something's going wrong. And I'm like, please hold, let me just consult AI, right? Like we can't do that. So that's a uniquely human thing. And it's like, how can we pull and simulate that so that in the classroom we can do exactly the same thing or at the bedside so that we take away this idea of wait, hold on, like you can kind of go back and ask again. When it comes to understanding, right, this contextualizing answers within emotional, moral, and ethical considerations, selecting relevant information and explaining significance is something that's uniquely human. And again, when AI can do that, it's because we fed it that information to start with. So it can accurately describe or define a concept. It could recognize a related example. It could translate to another language, not always accurately, might I add, as somebody who's tried that. But there's again, we still need to verify and put it back into our context, right? Because ChatGPT doesn't have our background knowledge. And finally, moving to remember on that, really focusing that we can recall that information in situation where technology is not readily accessible, like in an emergency, like in a meeting, when we're having a conversation with our peers. And if we need some assistance or some more or some synonyms, we can retrieve that factual information. We can get possible answers, define a term, construct a basis of chronology, have something be generated at various levels without, a ton of additional information. But we can't access that in that moment, right? So that's still our brain's sort of computing power. So now that we've sort of laid the foundation, laid the groundwork in Bloom's taxonomy, we've described what is uniquely human to us and what is moving into the more, hey, we can use ChatGPT or generative AI to support and supplement learning in these areas. Let's talk about some assignments. So there's three different maybe categories or bins of assignments that we've come across in the literature. And this isn't extensive or exhaustive. It's, again, a 45-minute session. I think I could run like several hours on just one of these boxes, but think about assignments in one of these three buckets. So AI integrated assignments, where students actively use AI tools to generate, analyze, enhance, or compare something that AI has done. So you're taking an assignment that you already have. You're asking the student to do one piece, and then you're asking AI to do another. And ideally, you would explain to the student that they would do their piece first. And we're going to give an example of that moving forward. The second would be an AI use reflection and transparency. So this would be useful for assignments that allow the use of AI, but in the use of AI, students are required to, sorry, jumping ahead, document use, reflect on the use of that AI, share the prompts and their decision-making process. Why did you agree? Why did you agree to keep this section in there that ChatGPT had you put in there in the first place? Why didn't you choose to rewrite your prompt? Was this enough? Did you need something more? And also discussing ethical considerations in each of these pieces, right? We know the bias that comes with AI. We know the hallucinations that come with AI and what impact that can make. And then the third level is, or the third category, I should say, I would put them in categories rather than levels, is AI supported scaffolding. So designing assignments where AI is assisting in some of these components, but keeping the aspects fully driven. And so one example of this is, and I don't know if you've all had this experience as educators, but I certainly have. I assign a research project and I say to my students, you're working on this aphasia therapy. And the students will say, great, like, or they'll pick, their aphasia or dysphagia therapy. And, 2 weeks later, they'll come to me, or a week later, they'll come to me and say, Dr. K, I can't find anything on this aphasia therapy. I've scoured the entire internet. And I'm like, well, I happen to know that there's a lot published on it. So maybe they're using the wrong search terms, right? So that would be an appropriate use of AI to say, right? If I were assisting a student to write this prompt, I would say, okay, well, why don't you go ahead and try to write a prompt to help you find some alternatives. But what have you already searched, right? It's the same thing that I would have done with them. I would have sat down and said, okay, well, tell me what you're searching. Okay, what other terms are you searching? What are you searching them in conjunction with? Okay, maybe we need to broaden and not just say aphasia, but maybe we need to go into the exact subtype of aphasia. Maybe we need to talk about language. Maybe we need to talk about post-stroke. Like, what do we need to do in order to do that? And saying, "Hey, I've searched this. I'm not getting anything. What else can I search?" That's something that AI could possibly assist with, right? So it's a tool rather than a replacement. Think of it as a calculator in that example. So going through our 3 bins, um, for our AI integrated assignments, so asking students to actively use AI tools, and these aren't necessarily separated. Here's one example. So AI and student product comparison, crafting a public health policy brief. Students can select a current public health issue, whatever that might be. They would then, without using AI, and first, draft their own policy brief using course concepts. And they would come up with that brief, and then they would lay it aside. Maybe you would even have them submit it to you ahead of time. And then they would use ChatGPT to generate a policy brief addressing the issue. And then they would look back at their version and ChatGPT's version, and they would say, okay, how is the clarity, the depth, the evidence of use, the persuasiveness noted, and assessed between the two, and then provide you with a comparison on those. And that kind of accomplishes a multitude of things, including sort of showing where AI is missing that human perspective. I recently did this in a class with students looking at having a treatment method or suggesting a treatment method. And so in this example, the caregiver came to the patient, to the speech pathologist, and said, I heard about this cool new therapy. I want you to use it with my loved one. And the student was to draft a 250-word email response. And so the students drafted their responses, and then they had ChatGPT or a different generative AI draft an equal, follow the same prompt essentially. And I was really surprised when they came to class to present, and they said, we've only done 3 presentations so far, so stay tuned, there might be more. And they said to me, I was really surprised that ChatGPT really took like these 2 articles that I looked at, and they came to a consensus, and so that's what it focused on. But I don't agree with it because I looked at these 5 articles and the other 3 didn't agree with those 2. And so I don't agree with what ChatGPT said. And so I was like really surprised as to how in depth they looked at this. And so I think they actually learned more through that process than previously, because we've been doing that assignment way before AI was being used so pervasively. So that's one example. Excuse the aside there, the personal example too. But for the second type, the use of reflection and transparency, we have this another example. So that's permissible AI use. Provide an explanation of a specific treatment to a patient. The student is given a clinical vignette, a specific patient case example. Students are provided with guidelines. AI use is permitted in this assignment. However, you may not use AI to generate the content for you. Acceptable uses include a thought partner, grammar, and proofreading with explanations, role playing, and any use of AI must be documented. So sure, you can use this. Here are your guidelines for which you can use this. And students then must document exactly their prompts, what they used it for, when they used it, what the output was. And they must then say, okay, how did AI shape your thinking or change your overall product from where you started to where you ended? Where did AI make mistakes and how did they correct them, right? So there are also, like, for example, commercial products available in the use of medicine, right? I believe there are even some that have been cleared to be used widely. And so using an assignment like this really gets students to say, hey, I really have to critically evaluate what's being put out there and what I'm putting into it. And the third type was this AI supported scaffolding. So our example was data interpretation with AI support. Now, I want to be very clear. You probably wouldn't do this in a data analysis class where you're teaching students how to analyze data. But if your main overarching goal was not, a statistics course, but rather where they could use that support, right? So students would select a topic. Students would then find publicly available data and use AI to help summarize trends, identify correlations, etc., with the proper terms. If you've been to our data analysis and visualization class, you would learn that it's not, we have to use Python, it doesn't do math, so on and so forth. Students would then assess the AI outputs. They would review biases and any gaps, and then they would locate published content to support or refute the findings summarized by AI. And then they would submit both the assignment and their reflection on the process and conclusions. So a lot of these assignment types have this idea of a reflection on the process. So to summarize, there's three main buckets, essentially an AI and student comparison bucket, or the use of AI as a simulation, possibly, that you could use a custom GPT for. The second would be AI use, reflection, and transparency, a reflection on how AI was used, form for documenting transparency and guidelines for use. And the third would be this AI supported scaffolding, where the student and the AI split the work in a very strategic way, right? Not just like any which way, in a very strategic way. So these three buckets are not independent of one another, right? They can overlap and have components of others, but these are general ideas that are out there in the AI literature. So, from the medical education side, there have been recommendations put forward from AAMC regarding the use of AI, and they're here for your reference. There are four main ones, I think, when we think about developing curricula. One of these is maintaining a human-centered focus, right? Understanding that integrating AI is simply a tool, but it is a human-centered approach that we need to take into account. A second is ensuring ethical and transparent use, where we're prioritizing responsible use and transparency. And I think that when appropriate, and I can't stress that enough, when appropriate, it is not always appropriate to incorporate AI and to have students evaluate some of the work that's being put forward will help them ensure that ethical and transparent use. Develop curricula through interdisciplinary collaborations. So implementing AI curricula through collaboration with experts from different fields, including ethics, right, sociology, and other relevant fields. And again, this is geared towards AAMC recommendations, and monitoring and evaluating. So continuously teaching students how to evaluate and the implementation of these tools, as well as ourselves, right? I'm not an expert at that yet, and yet I am here talking to you, right? It's an evolving process, and these things are constantly changing. So there are other guidelines that have been put forward from professional organizations. So the American Medical Association created a policy for AI, for a framework in AI in healthcare. It really prioritizes ethics, evidence-based decision-making, and equity. It talks about supporting augmented intelligence rather than AI replacing human decision-making, and stresses that. So I think we're starting to see an emerging theme here, but I think you all already knew this. AMI, the International Association for Health Professions Education, also is has put forward guidelines on the use of integrating AI responsibly. So, what are some focuses of course design that we can look towards to focus on critical thinking both with and without AI? So, active learning strategies such as a flipped classroom, right? So, focusing on foundational level content as pre-work prior to attending class. And I understand that that has its own challenges, right? And having like an entry ticket to class, right? With a pre-quiz, right? Having these foundational level um, assignments that are really focused, leaning towards micro learning, right? To ensure that they're getting done. And then maybe I shouldn't say ensure, to more likely have them get done, right? And then looking at AI as a potential AI tutor or learning companion outside of class, right? I sometimes get emails at 2 in the morning. I am sound asleep by 9:30 p.m. So those emails aren't reaching me until the next day, but kind of this personalized learning, right, where that student is and feeding the information to the AI that we want to be there. So possibly with a custom GPT for a learning companion outside of a specific class. And then focusing class time on discussion of application and case-based scenarios to assess student learning. So really looking at small group work, looking at discussion-based content, possibly even looking at free work during class on some of this content outside of the use of AI. Some other strategies are team learning, right? We know about problem and team-based learning, but when you're including AI into this space, you can, again, simulate some content into that team-based learning. You could assign case studies where students can really explore from the top down. You focus on presentations that explain the concepts. You looked at peer-to-peer teaching, but also some really robust discussions about when AI is incorporated or when a simulation takes place in one of these cases on how to sort of navigate that and what were some pluses and what were some minuses. And there's always a ton of minuses that students always point out. So along with some positive outcomes, right? And then considering a grand rounds type of discussion for the share out, having students share their content out of what they've learned and really explaining to their peers in I don't want to say sort of an off the cuff explanation, but something without visuals, something that really tests that understanding, and really helps you as the instructor find gaps if they exist. And then evaluation, right? So provide a group critique or evaluation of AI output, providing AI generated content on a given prompt, requesting students to assess for accuracy, bias, and clarity. And I can't stress that bias piece enough. And then collaboratively refine as a class by expanding and finding additional content. Another thing I've done is provide students with content generated by AI and ask them to critique it. And, here's, and not actually say that it's done by AI. Does this answer the question? If not, how would you answer the question? Almost like in a true and false scenario, if you've ever given a true and false question on an exam, and if the question is false, please correct it to be true. Sort of that same idea. AI is a simulation. So really having the generative AI take on a persona of a care partner, a patient, or a collaborator. It might be asking students to do a first pass of their presentation for feedback and refinement. It might be asking the student to use AI as a consult and providing specific areas where content can be taken from. Remember, the semantic webs, the generative AI, the predictive language, but if you're providing it with exactly what it can look at, then that expert consultant, it's actually a nice kind of back and forth. I have a friend who calls me her speech language pathologist in a pocket. She's a palliative care physician, and if she has a question, she texts me. And so this is almost like that substitute. I don't have to walk around in her pocket anymore. So just another idea of using AI as a simulation, again, when appropriate. And then moving into AI literacy and ethical use. So teaching the proper citation of AI use, and we have a document to that effect, so I can share that. So ensuring students understand that they must and how to acknowledge AI generated content appropriately in academic writing and in assignments. Ethical decision making exercises, considering cases or use examples where students must decide when and how AI should ethically be used in healthcare professions. There was a really neat study that was presented at AAMC Learn, Serve, Lead this year that talked about how students they used visual learning and how they talked about how AI could be helpful in these areas, but it definitely couldn't do these other areas, and really kind of getting to, okay, well, like, what are the differences and how would you do that differently? So really letting the students make those decisions. So some key takeaways from as our time is coming to an end, and we'll have some time for questions and discussion, but starting the conversation about AI use early. So from the very start of class, how it's acceptable, how it's not acceptable, having clear guidelines for both assignments and overall class structure. So you might have certain guidelines for the class, and then you might have slightly different ones for the actual assignments that are occurring in the class, or an exception, or just a simple reminder. Consider flipping Bloom's taxonomy to focus on higher level thinking and application in class, right? So really focusing on how can we do the remember things before we get to class so we can focus on the apply things inside of class, and then possibly the create things outside of class with this evaluation component. And then considering using AI as a partner in assignments where it could be helpful, and having the proper guardrails in place so that you can make sure that you can assess and support students as they need to be supported based on how they're working in the class. And then incorporate the use of AI in a way that makes sense, and only if it makes sense, and provide background information to learners. So AI is out there. It's like AI all the time, right? But it's a useful tool in many ways, and in other ways, it's a less useful tool, or it doesn't make sense in a certain space, right? It makes no sense for me to bring my down jacket when I go on vacation to a tropical place, right? And it's the same idea with AI. If it makes sense, it makes sense. And if it doesn't, then that's okay too. But you're really focusing on what the goals of your assignment and the outcome that you want to achieve are. So, with that, I want to thank you for your attention and spending time with me in this last instance of our live series.